The last lecture in this series covers natural selection, right? It's the last mechanism that we haven't really dictated. Remember that evolution is a law and a theory. Evolution is law because we have defined evolution as a change in gene or allele frequency over time. We cannot prevent that from happening. We talk about the how and the why. Why are these genes or allele frequencies changing? How are these genes or allele frequencies changing? And we covered a number of different mechanisms in the second part, with the exception of natural selection, which is what we're covering right here. We'll focus on things like how selection is manifested through things like balanced polymorphism. You do have things like speciation, and then we'll just touch on a little bit of sexual selection because it will be something that is touched on when we move into the second part of the course to talk about primates. What we may ask, of course, is how is selection manifested? There are a number of key components to natural selection, and we can't necessarily discuss natural selection in one, sweeping swoop. It's quite complex. There's a number of different factors. One of them, of course, if you want to see a trait evolve via natural selection, an organism needs to actually leave more offspring than other organisms, right? And then you typically have to have greater reproductive output, meaning not just having lots of offspring, but offspring that actually survive into adulthood or sexual maturity in order for them to reproduce. And that is dependent on the mortality of individuals. How long do individuals live in order to actually reproduce? So understand that natural selection, when we create models to discuss it, that there are other factors, and that includes things like fertility and mortality. Here's a really neat example, a classic example that's discussed when we talk about polymorphism. Polymorphism simply is just when two or more phenotypes exist. If we want to talk about the phenotypic level, what we actually see is as long as you have two or more, you're talking about polymorphism. Sometimes these polymorphisms can be balanced, meaning that you'll just see fluctuations of them over time, where you'll see more of, in this case, we have the peppered moth example, where in one generation or a few generations, you might see more of the pigmented or melanic moth. Melanin is the type of cells, or it causes pigmentation. Melanocytes are the cells that create the pigment, and then melanin is the actual, molecular name for pigmentation. So a melanic moth would be one that's highly pigmented or darker in color. You can see that there is one that's not as melanic. It's kind of a checkered or black and white moth. So in one generation, you may see more of the melanic moths. In the next generation, you might see less. And it's up to evolutionary biologists to come up with an explanation as to how or why, using evolutionary mechanisms. But what we noticed with the peppered moth, and in particularly the United Kingdom. So in the United Kingdom, during the Industrial Revolution, right, they actually pumped a lot of pollution and smoke into the air. And what this did is it killed a lot of lichen on the trees, which is a nice little substrate for the moths to land on. And it not only killed the lichen, but it dyed the bark of trees black. And what this did is, of course, before, when you had enough lichen on the trees, birds and other animals that prey on these moths, they could easily see the melanic moths, ones with darker pigmentation, because the ones that are checkered, they kind of blend in or camouflage under the lichen background, which is the photo here on the left. The photo on the right shows them on the bark that's been dyed by, like smoke or darker bark. And you can see that the more highly pigmented moth is the one that blends in or is more camouflaged to that background. And it is the checkered moth that is very easily seen by predators. So you can see that before industrialization, there's lots of lichen on trees, and we see less melanic moths because they're getting eaten. Just the opposite, when there's too much pollution and there's less lichen, then we see more of the darker pigmented moths because the ones that are checkered are the ones getting eaten. If you look at the chart here on the left, matter of fact, what happens after industrialization and a number of different environmental laws to help protect the environment, we actually saw the lichen return, and that would also mean selection against melanic moths, because the melanic moths, or darker pigmented moths, they can be easily seen on the lichen. So if you noticed, this is just fluctuation over time for different phenotypes, and it is effectively balanced in a way because you saw it being preferred in a number of generations and then selected against in others. And this can happen over time, typically based on a number of different environmental factors in this case. Here is an example of natural selection that I discussed briefly in terms of point mutation, where a single point mutation can change to make glutamate instead of valine in terms of amino acid, and now you're producing sickle cell hemoglobin and not normal hemoglobin. Well, this follows Mendelian pattern of inheritance. If you're homozygous dominant, you have both copies of normal hemoglobin, and you don't really have any problems transporting oxygen to the rest of your body with your red blood cells, and you don't have any health problems associated with your red blood cells. Now, if you have sickle cell disease, you actually have, you're homozygous recessive, you have two copies of the sickle cell trait, or the sickle cell allele. You have two copies of the sickle cell allele. Now, you have a mosaic of cells, most of which are sickle, and sickle shaped, and you have major problems transporting the oxygen to the rest of your body, and highly susceptible to iron deficiency. You get anemia regularly. And if you are heterozygous, meaning you have one copy of normal and one copy of sickle cell allele, then you have what's known as sickle cell trait. And this is where you have a mosaic of cells, some of which include sickle cell shaped red blood cells. And if you are in a malarial endemic area where malaria is something that your people have to deal with, that you grow up with it, these are usually in places along the equator to the extents of the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, more or less. You can see that places on this chart to the right, lower right, places in Central and South America, Africa, Arabian Peninsula, Indian subcontinent, and all over Southeast Asia are highly susceptible to malaria. If you have normal hemoglobin, both copies, you are homozygous dominant, you are highly susceptible to malaria as a child and even into adulthood. If you have sickle cell disease, you actually confer immunity to malaria. You typically do not get malaria, but you have a debilitating disease that also may cause you to die in early childhood. If you have one copy of normal and one copy of sickle cell allele, you have what's known as heterozygous advantage, because you confer immunity to malaria, right? Because you have some sickle cell red blood cells and some that are normal. And typically what will happen is if the malaria parasite invades your cells, your body kind of forces it to invade the sickle cells. And this is not good for the parasite to invade the host. And so this is why we actually see, think about it, this is a disease allele that actually is gaining frequency over time in malarial endemic areas. And there's a select few of blood polymorphisms like this. So think about it. If you have a disease in a population, natural selection would seek to remove it, right? Natural selection keeps good things in a population and removes bad things. So if something that we would see as a disease is bad, it's increasing. Well, it's increasing because there is heterozygous condition that confers immunity to malaria. You do have some health problems associated with you in terms of managing iron deficiency anemia. But for the most part, you have heterozygous advantage, being able to move through any human environment on the planet. Speciation is something important to talk about because it is something that occurs when gene flow is eliminated. And you can have new subpopulations that begin evolving away from each other and becoming their own species. This means they can typically no longer interbreed. We do have other designations like subspecies where you can still see some interbreeding. As organisms begin to evolve away from each other, there are a number of different mechanisms that nature has. One is that basically the penis and vagina in sexually reproducing organisms are like a lock and key mechanism. As organisms begin to evolve away from each other, the lock and key may not fit. That's one way nature begins to create boundaries between species. Another way is that even if there is sexual intercourse, the sperm may not be strong enough to kind of penetrate the egg. So even though you might have, natural intercourse, then this may not be able to occur in the wild. And this actually is how we make tyons and ligers, lion and tiger mixes, depending on, it all depends which one's male, which one's female. They cannot naturally have sexual intercourse or, naturally conceive. So they've actually done this in a laboratory setting. So it's not natural, right? Another way nature creates boundaries between species is that even if there might be fertilization possible, if they begin evolving away from each other too much, then the offspring will not be fertile, and then you can't perpetuate that as a new species. One good example is when a horse and a donkey mate, right? They actually produce a mule, and that mule that they produce cannot mate with another mule to make a mule. There are some rare exceptions, but you can see that nature even has its own mechanisms when speciation is occurring and is in place. Sexual selection is the last component I just want to briefly mention, and you notice, some of the components of natural selection is being able to, create more offspring, right? Differential reproductive success and differential reproductive output. Being able to produce more offspring and more offspring that survive into adulthood and sexual maturity to also reproduce themselves. So this is oftentimes due to mating success, right? Differential reproductive success, not output. Output is that they actually survive to adulthood oftentimes. Differential reproductive success is just how many offspring can I produce? Well, this is due to mating success. And in order to mate in sexually reproducing organisms, it is the female that chooses who she mates with. And there are a number of different display behaviors that are conducted. You may think about an example. Many people think about this one blackbird that has a number of different, very colorful plumage under its wings, and the male will actually jut out its wings and do this little dance to both showing the colorful plumage and kind of the way the bird can move. Now the female is observing this male dancing as well as the color, like his phenotype, right? And if this is attractive to her, then it may be attractive to her babies in the future, right? They may be able to attract mates or be attractive to others, and it will create the best chance for her offspring. And so this is something the female is taking into consideration, and that's why you have a number of different males that are vying or battling for access to receptive females. This is what male competition or mate competition is. And you have mate choice, right? Females preferring specific males in their troop. Give an example of the mandrill, which is here on this slide, the pictured primate here. This is the male. And the male, this is Rafiki from The Lion King. The male has very large snout and nose, and it's very colorful. It's red down the middle, and then it has these, kind of blue iridescent, lateral projections off the nose, and you have this very colorful golden goatee and facial hair. The female doesn't really have these bright colors, and her nose is actually very small. And we think that this male looks so colorful because females have chosen it, right? Females have decided that this is the most attractive presentation out of all the evolutionary changes that have occurred over how many generations, that this is something that is attractive to females, and we'll see it perpetuate in males over time. And we may see it change different. You can even look at humans in this way. Males typically have very large brow ridges just above their eyes, their eye orbits, right? Very thick piece of bone situated there. Females don't have this. Females have very small brow ridges. They almost don't even exist. And so the best explanation is that females prefer males that have these really big brow ridges. Otherwise, they wouldn't necessarily be there. So, it's really interesting to think about sexual selection in some ways. And this is oftentimes when you can find a trait that looks effectively neutral in some ways. And why it persists is because of females.